welcome to the podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, welcome there as well. Today we have a podcast and an episode about a question that we get very often, especially right now because of what's going on with the housing market. And that is, should I be renting or should I be buying? And so we are going to be talking about the 5 pros and cons that we've laid out about buying a home versus renting. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Before we jump into it, if you're listening on the podcast, be sure to subscribe. If you're on YouTube, hit the subscribe button as always. It helps us. It helps you because then you're going to be notified when new episodes come out. And also be sure to share this with your friends just to make sure that you're spreading the word. Again, it helps everybody involved. So thank you, first and foremost. Let's jump right into it. So, renting versus buying. First and foremost, before we even dive into the 5 pros and cons, this is really a personalized answer for everybody because rents are different in different locations. Home prices are different. Your jobs are different. Everything is different in various locations. So I highly recommend when it comes to rent versus buy. Like, we have a few tools that can help you. I mean, there's tools on the internet. The big thing about our tool that I'll just tell you right now is it takes into account everything about you. So it's basically looking at the complete situation. So obviously I'm biased towards my tool, but at the end of the day, the stuff that we're going to be talking about today is there's some numbers that we're going to be talking about today, but we're going to be focusing more on the mental side of things. I will come out with other podcasts, other YouTube videos and blogs and whatnot that deep dive into numbers, but this one is more for things that you just need to think about, that most of the time you don't hear these things from people when they're bringing this up. Okay, so let's jump right into it. Pros and cons. Should you rent or buy a house? Number 1, this has to do with basically stress and anxiety. Okay, I'm going to go into some background so you can understand this. So we've all heard of like the pride of ownership or the American dream, right? Like the American dream. I'm going to stick on that one. The American dream is buying a house. First of all, the American dream, that's actually a marketing slogan. The Realtors Association really plugs that one now, but back in the day, it was bankers that were really doing it. You have to understand why. Back in the day, let's just say 100 years ago, bankers and banks made money by lending money to businesses. That was pretty high risk, okay? And so they said, well, how do we get less risk? And they said, well, like if we start borrowing a house, like against a house, that's less risk because if the person stops paying us, we can actually take their house, right? It's very easy. And so that's where the quote-unquote American dream was born, of buying a house and getting a loan and, getting a mortgage, and then it just ran from there, okay? Nothing wrong with that dream. I love, ownership. I love talking about pride of ownership and the freedom of being able to actually own something. That should never be taken for granted, okay? But that's just an understanding, because where that came from, we all think this American dream, and we start dreaming of what our house is going to look like. So you might be like, look, the house I'm going to have in the future is, 3 bedrooms and this size and has a little white picket fence in the front. Some of us can even picture a dog in the background running around, okay? What we don't anticipate and what we don't think about is the upkeep and the anxiety and when things go wrong. We don't ever think about that. Okay, but when you own a house, let's just say, I'm going to give you an example. Let's just say you own your house and you had a really late night at work. Maybe your boss made you stay extra, a patient showed up late, whatever it was. So let's just say you typically get home at 6 p.m. Tonight you got home at 7:30 p.m. And because of that, you only go to bed around 10:30, but tonight you're going to bed at midnight. You might not even be getting in the shower until 11:30, whatever it is. And let's just say you got to wake up to go to work at 6 a.m. in the morning. So you go in, you go take a shower, you go to use the bathroom, you flush the toilet, and the pipe breaks. And it's almost midnight at that point. No plumber is going to pick up their phone, right? So now you're stuck sitting there saying, okay, I got to figure out how to turn this off. Which the same thing would happen if you're renting, right? You got to figure out how to turn off the water because you got a pipe leaking, all this other stuff. Like, you got to figure that out. So the difference, though, is now it might be like 1 in the morning. You got to wake up in 5 hours. When you own that house, you go to work at like 6, 7 in the morning, whatever it is. Plumbers, again, are not going to be up that early. So now you're trying to call plumbers in between your patients or during your work schedule, like your 15-minute break. You're trying to call these plumbers. And then on top of that, you have to then turn around and try to coordinate a time for them to get there. Rent, everything's taken care of. You don't have to think about it. Pipe breaks, you wake up, you send an email to your landlord, you move on with your life, and they coordinate everything. They got keys to your house. They do everything. All right? That stress level, a lot of people don't ever really think about that when they think about the buying a house versus renting a house. They don't think about that stress level and what that could potentially do. And so on this run, for this pro and con, it goes to renting a house. Okay, it's much more beneficial than, and I'll tell you guys a little bit more later on. Like, I own 2 houses. I'll tell you how that came about. But it sucks having to deal with your own stuff. I remember back in the days when I was renting, it's like, great, like, call the landlord, fix it. Like, I'm going to go move on with the rest of my day, right? So that is, pros and cons of renting versus buying, number one. Number two, should you rent versus buy? And that is that you're tied down. Okay? I'll give you an example of this, like, of myself. At one point in my life, I was moving a lot for opportunities. And when you're renting, you can do that. So, for example, I moved, I think it was 5 times in 6 years, okay? 3 of those moves were within the same company because they were moving me up. And they're like, look, we have this position, but it's in this location. We want to give it to you. We'd be willing to move. It's like, well, yeah, if you guys pay me X amount, it's like, great, we'll pay you X amount to move. It's like, fantastic, let's go. You can do that when you rent, okay? And then after a while, the 4th and 5th time I moved, it was because different job opportunities at different companies. Like, they were going to give me a lot more money and the jobs were better. So I moved again, right? So you can just up and do that when you rent. When it comes to home ownership, it's like, yes, you can potentially move. That's not, necessarily a problem, right? But the issue is like, you might have to like sell your house. And at the same time, when you're moving, so all of a sudden you're selling your house, you're trying to move, you got those moving expenses, your house is on the market. Let's just say worst case scenario, it's a bad housing market. Now all of a sudden your house is sitting there for a long time and you can't sell it. Like, and you're forced to sell it. So it's not a good situation. It ties you down. Even if you say, yes, I can sell it, not all the time. It might be a lot harder than you think. On the other side of that too, people are like, look, I see this all the time happen to people, all the time. I brought up the examples of like where I was able to move because of opportunities and whatnot. I see this all the time. People buy a house, they're all excited, and they got an opportunity. It could be an opportunity for a job. It could be an opportunity to start their own business, whatever it is. And they won't do it because they just bought their house like a year ago, right? Like, they might get this awesome opportunity, but they got to move to another state, another city, whatever it is. And they're like, well, no, like I just settled down here. Like, I just bought a house. It's like, okay, that's great. Like, you just gave up that flexibility in what you're able to do with your life. So if you cherish the flexibility, when it comes to renting versus buying a house, this pro has to go to renting in terms of flexibility, right? So there's an advantage to renting versus buying, okay? So that is pros and cons number 2 to should you buy or rent a house. Number 3 has to do with financial risk. So when it comes to financial risk, I'm gonna talk to you about the 2 primary things that most people talk about, and they're there, but there's actually a third, in my opinion, that is more important than the first 2. Okay. The first one that people talk about is that financial risk. There's more risk in owning a house because of the mortgage payment, property taxes, and everything else, right? Like, if I lose my job or if I can't make the payment, whatever it is, it's more expensive to try to maintain the mortgage. And yes, that's right. But if you can't maintain your mortgage, you probably shouldn't have gotten a mortgage to begin with. Okay, like that just, it doesn't make sense. And in the case of unemployment, I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on. It's like if all of a sudden your mortgage becomes unaffordable, it shouldn't be a surprise to you. You probably got over leveraged. So that financial risk I look at, but it's not huge on my list. The second one is that you risk the home value going down. Again, we're talking about a primary house, okay? Most people buy a primary house and it's going to be their forever home, right? Their long-term house. They're going to be in it for the next 30 or 40 years. So, short-term housing price decreases doesn't matter. Again, we're not talking about an investment property. We're not talking about a condo. We're not talking about starter home, a house that you're flipping. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about like your primary house. It's like, like we bought our house out here in Texas, I think 2 or 3 years ago. And at that time, I thought the market's gone through the roof out here already. Like we're at a high, it's going to tank. And I was just like, well, it doesn't matter. If I got to stay here for the next 30 years, I'm staying here. Like it doesn't matter, right? So those are the two risks that people most of the time bring up. And for me, I don't really look at those. Yeah, I know they're risk and they're good to understand what they are, but they're not the number one financial risk, okay? The number one financial risk is this. I'm going to go through this almost like an example so that way you guys understand this. Let's call it tail-end risk. So something that has low probability of happening, but it can, okay? For those risks, a lot of times we'll say, hey, have an emergency fund, right? So like if you have like a $15,000 emergency fund, $10,000 emergency fund, whatever it is, that's for the tail-end risk. So what I mean by tail-end risk is, let's just say you do lose your job. And I say that's tail-end because unemployment for most people in professions in this country is like 4 or 5%. So when you think about it, that's the tail end of the population, right? So like if you become unemployed, that's potentially tail-end risk. Or like a medical like emergency or whatever it is. That's more tail-end type of scenarios. And so you have your emergency fund to cover these things. And you have your emergency fund to cover these things, okay? But let's just look at the two scenarios, you rent versus own, okay? If I'm owning a house, actually, let me start with renting. If I'm renting a house, basically I'm using my emergency fund to cover all my expenses and rent and food and utilities and all that type of stuff. And a lot of times what happens when people have those major events, they'll sit around for like a month or two and they'll be like, well, I'm okay for now. And all of a sudden, like reality sinks in. They're out of money. And so, when you get an eviction notice, some states, it's like 2 or 3 days, you're out. Like, period, you're gone. Like, now you're trying to figure out what to do in those 2 or 3 days. Like, you're out quickly, okay? Some states are like 20 or 30 days, but most of them are short. You're out quick. So the bottom line is, like, if you're renting and you have a catastrophe in terms of finances, you're out quick. Now, let's just say you own a house. Best case scenario, you got some equity in your house. Maybe you have a line of credit against the house. You lose your job, great. You can start drawing against the line of credit. I'll do another podcast on another episode where I talk about having a line of credit. I recommend doing it for everybody. Okay, but let's just say in another scenario, you don't have equity in your house. Let's just say, or a small amount. Maybe it's like only 10 or 20 grand. Okay, like maybe you just bought the house like 2 years ago or whatever it is. You can sit there and say, look, I have 10 to 20 grand in the bank. That's all I have. I got to figure out if I should eat. I need to, pay for utilities. I need some cash cushion just in case, like it takes me longer to find a job. In reality, what you can do, and this is like worst case scenario, you just don't pay your mortgage, right? Like, yes, you'll accrue interest. Yes, you potentially get late and you have collections and your credit score goes down. But this is a dire situation. And in a dire situation, you need time. And you need to be able to expand the use of the money that you do have. And so when you own a house, the foreclosure process can take like 6 to 9 months. The rental, like eviction process, can be like a few days. So if you own the house, worst case scenario in terms of financial risk, like you can literally just sit in your house for 6 months and be focusing on like trying to get your job back, your health condition, finding another place to live, whatever it is, it buys you time, and this reduces the stress on yourself. So in terms of rent versus buy, pros and cons, number 3, to me, the financial risk, I flip on this versus most financial professionals. I say that owning a house is less risky. And the reason being because the primary risk that financial professionals oftentimes state, I just view as not being that big of a deal if you're buying a house correctly anyways. The big thing is protecting yourself in the tail end event of just catastrophe to your finances. Owning a house is going to give you some more flexibility. Okay, so that is pros and cons of renting a house, number 3. And if you guys want some extra information on like having a line of credit when you own a house and why to do it, I'll put some links into like a video and blogs and whatnot into the show notes and on YouTube, so that way you guys can see what I'm referring to on that. Okay, now number 4, pros and cons of buying versus renting a house. Number 4 is that it is quote unquote cheaper to rent. Okay, what does this actually mean? Well, we have to look at this at 2 different time periods, both today and in, tomorrow. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. Okay, today, if you rent, that's basically your expenses. Maybe you got some renter's insurance. That's pretty cheap though. And that's, your expenses for housing, that is. When you own a house, you got your mortgage. You got your homeowner's insurance. Many of you are going to do 3% to 10% down, which means you have mortgage insurance, property taxes, upkeep expenses. Those are all what I call total housing expenses. Okay, when you look at that on a month-to-month basis, it traditionally is far more than actually renting. So today, renting is typically cheaper than buying a house. Okay, now tomorrow, this is where financial professionals, and I differ from other financial professionals when they're saying, well, one of the pros of buying a house is that you pay off your mortgage and then it's cheaper after that. And it's like, really? Is it? Just because you don't have a mortgage anymore might mean you don't have mortgage insurance, but you still have 3 other expenses: property taxes, homeowners insurance, and upkeep. Okay, I'm going to focus on property tax. Okay, the reason being is because let's look at this scenario. Okay, if I stop paying my property taxes, the government is going to come in and take my house and basically kick me out of my house. Okay, well, if I rent and I stop paying my rent, the landlord is going to come and kick me out of my house. So the way I view home ownership is that you actually don't ever own your house. You're basically renting your house and the land that it's on from the government, because the same thing happens if you don't pay, and the landlord is the government. So therefore, what I always say is, in this situation, it can get very, very, very expensive owning a house in retirement. And I see this all the time. Okay, like out here in Austin, Texas, there's this big thing because a lot of people have had their houses for a long time, and now property taxes have gone up. So should you rent or buy a house? Pro and con number 4 is that it's cheaper to rent. Okay, this you have to think about as today and tomorrow. Okay, so today, rent on a month-to-month basis is most of the time going to be cheaper than buying a house. Like a mortgage is primarily always more expensive than renting most of the time. Not always, most of the time. Okay, but that's where people make a mistake. Most of the time, they only look at the mortgage. But in reality, you got the mortgage. Most of you are going to be doing like a 3 to 10% down payment for a house. So that means that you got mortgage insurance, you got property tax, you got homeowners insurance, you got upkeep. Those 5 things are what I refer to as total housing expenses. And they oftentimes are far more than just renting. So today, when you're saying, well, is it cheaper? Renting most of the time is going to be cheaper. Okay, like 90-something% of the time, I would say. So tomorrow is the big deal, because that's where a lot of financial professionals will say, buy a house. Like I hear them on podcasts and radio channels and books all the time. Buy a house because rent is going to be really expensive when you're in retirement. And When you own a house at retirement and you pay it off, you don't have, that expense anymore. And it's like, well, okay. Well, there's 5 housing expenses. If you pay off your mortgage, you don't have a mortgage, and you don't have mortgage insurance anymore. You still have property tax, you still have homeowners insurance, you still have upkeep. So is it cheaper? Hard to say, right? It's hard to say, like, projecting out like 30, 40 years from now, if those things are going to be more expensive than rent. Nobody knows. Okay. Now, at the end of the day, though, I look back and I look at evidence and I say, look, like here in, for example, Austin, Texas, there's a huge outcry from people that owned their houses here for a very long time. Okay. So, like housing prices have gone up, property taxes have gone through the roof. So there's some people here that pay in property taxes every month the same amount as they would pay in rent, and it's forcing them to move because they can't afford it. Okay. And people are like, well, property tax, like, what do you mean? And so I want to explain this to you because this is the way I think about it. If you don't pay your property tax, the government is going to come in and kick you out of your house. If you rent and you don't pay your rent, your landlord is going to come and kick you out of your house. I don't ever look at it like I own my house. I always look at it as I'm renting my house because in essence, the same action happens if I don't pay my rent, meaning I get kicked out of my house. It's just that the government is the landlord, not the landlord of the person that owns the condo or the whatever else that I'm renting or the house that I'm renting. The government is the landlord. Like if you don't pay the property tax to them, you're gone. You're gone. So to me, it's this whole argument of, well, you don't have to pay the housing costs anymore once you're done. No, you're still paying rent. You're paying rent on top of a mortgage when you own a house. Like, does this make sense, right? But anyways, that at the end of the day, I just look at that argument of saying, well, it's going to be better tomorrow. That's not necessarily true of owning a house. Therefore, between today being cheaper and most likely and potentially a high likelihood that it's going to be even cost or maybe just close to each other in retirement, for the pros and cons of buying a house versus renting on this one, I would actually put it towards renting a house that is cheaper both today and potentially tomorrow. Okay. Now the 5th one. Okay. This is, one of those ones where it's like, it's really what you think. But there's also some numbers on this. That is, owning a house is a good investment. And you will hear financial professionals all day long that deep dive into numbers that are like, no, housing is a bad idea. Like, and I'll do a video and stuff, and I'll link to that in the notes about why they say that. Okay, I'm not going to deep dive into it today, but owning is a good investment, and primarily the reason why you hear that maybe is because, like, I heard this all the time growing up. I grew up in Silicon Valley, so it was like, I bought my house for $60,000 50 years ago. And now it's worth $600,000. Like, oh, I'm so like awesome and an investor and blah, blah, blah. And you look at it and you're like, well, wait a second. When you factor in the mortgage on that original house, you factor in upkeep, you factor in property taxes, you factor in insurances, the return on houses is actually not very good. Okay. And that's pretty much universal throughout the country. Like the housing market returns are not that good. Now, yes, there's some people that will buy a condo and 5 years later they sell it and they make a lot of money. Fantastic. I'm talking about primary homes where somebody bought and paid it, lived there for 30, 40, 50 years. Most of the time, the investment's not that good. Okay, the return. Now, does that mean that home ownership is not a good investment? I say it is still a good investment, but it also depends on what you are doing. Okay, and this leads us to 2 housing goals that I want you guys to remember on this, a huge takeaway from this podcast. If you're going to purchase a house, your goal is to have that house paid off by the time you hit retirement. Okay, I have seen so many retired people that still have a mortgage payment and then they retire and then they got to go back to work because they realize that they can't afford it. Okay, so don't let that happen to you. Number 2, if you rent, then your goal is to take the money you're not spending on a house, and instead of just spending it on horse shit, you actually invest it. And at the end of the day, your goal, if you're renting, is to be able to build up so much in assets that they are generating enough income for you to cover your rent. okay? The bottom line is, with housing goal number 1 and housing goal number 2, regardless of what you do not want to have a payment when you hit retirement. And that payment could be either in a mortgage or renting. And in a mortgage, you get rid of that payment by paying off the mortgage. And with renting, you get rid of that payment by having so much in assets that they're generating enough income for you that you don't have to worry about the rent because you have income that's covering the rent. Okay? So those are your 2 housing goals. Now, the reason why I put this as a pro for buying a house, right? Because you're like, well, wait a second. Like, I get all these benefits. Like, if I rent and if I save the money, that's a good thing. Why do I put this as a pro for buying a house? Like, because of this, I'd rather buy a house, right? At FitBucks, we look at human capital. That's like the biggest thing that differentiates us from other financial companies, okay? Within human capital is behavior. So we look at a lot of behavior. I mean, the outcomes, it doesn't matter what you're looking at, financial outcomes, healthcare outcomes, 80% of it comes from behaviors, okay? I know for a fact that the average person in this country, if they say, hey, if I was going to buy a house, but I'm going to rent instead because it's cheaper, the average person in this house, or in this country, is not going to invest that money or invest the full amount of the money or invest it correctly. Most people are going to go out and say, well, I have this much more money now, and they're going to blow it on stupid shit, and they're not going to invest, okay? Or they might say, I'm going to invest, but they invest in something like a bank account or a CD that's earning like 0.5%, and inflation like this month was at 5%. Like average inflation, let's just say, is 2 to 3%. So your money's actually losing money in the long run because of inflation, okay? So they don't invest it correctly. So because of that, I'm actually a big proponent of actually people buying their primary house because it automatically bakes in discipline. They have to pay it, and it's an asset that's building. And typically that asset, even though I said the investment returns are not that good, typically when you do the math, the investment returns of owning a house after all the costs is about 2 to 3% per year, which at least keeps up with inflation. That's why actually if you see wealthy people, they buy so much land because land actually is a good inflation hedge. And that's buying a house oftentimes is a good inflation hedge. And so because of people's behaviors, and buying a house automatically makes you pay off the mortgage and save and all that type of stuff because it builds equity in your house. That's why I say the last one is the last pros and cons of owning a house is a good investment. I say yes, the pro goes to owning a house. And that's not because of the numbers and what the numbers say. It's because of individuals' behaviors. Okay, now on the flip side of that, if you're the other way around, where you're like, look, I know this, I can invest, blah, 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 great. Then renting can be a great rate for you. And I close this out with this, and I'm going to give you a story of myself because people are like, well, what do you do? Like, I own 2 houses. I'm going to explain to you why, okay? I never ever thought of owning a house. I always just said, look, I'm a numbers guy. I can rent and invest money. That's what I'd rather do. I don't want the headache, okay? And I got married. My wife was like, no, we're buying a house. No, and that's a side note. But reality is that, like I said, I used to live in Silicon Valley, and I do everything as an investment. I look at investment stuff. So like if it would have been like 2006 and the housing market was at like highs, I would have been like, I'm not buying a house. Like that's ridiculous. Okay. But it was 2008 and the housing market had started tanking and it was like, look, I know Silicon Valley. I've been here my whole life. This is international real estate. Like, the entire United States went down like 20 or 30%. The Bay Area only went down like 5 or 10%. Like, this is a great time, to buy in the Bay Area. So we bought, a condo and it was like, okay, perfect. And then the housing prices over the last 10, 11 years went right back up, shot up, rents went sky high. And then we said, well, wait a second, like we can actually do a cash out refinance, pay cash for a house in Texas, move to Texas and actually have our renters in California paying for everything and still cash flow off of it. So we did that. So somebody else is actually paying for both assets while we get the equity in the asset and everything else. So that's like, I just wanted to give you that example because for this, it's always personalized to you. And like, what are you using the house for? Is this like your forever home and everything else? Or is it something that you're going to be in like for 4 or 5 years, or you're strategically buying it because the housing market just went down or whatever it is? Those are different scenarios. If you're just saying, hey, this is going to be my forever home and I'm going to rent versus buy a house, these 5 are pros and cons that we just touched on. Those are the things that you really need to think about. And it's not so much the nuts and bolts of here's the absolute numbers. It's really the mental side of things. Like, am I ready for this stress of owning a house? Dealing with the upkeep, those expenses that I might have. Like, am I just starting out my life and I only have like a $5,000 to $10,000 emergency fund, or do I have $100,000 in a retirement account just in case something goes wrong? I can use that too. Do I have enough for a down payment for 5 or 10% or even 20%? So those all come into the question. This is more about the mental side, like I said. The pros and cons. For me, oftentimes, especially for you new grads out there, I wouldn't necessarily rush into buying a house just as soon as you graduate. What I mean by that is probably like 5 to 10 years post-graduation, I wouldn't run into buying a house. That's just me. That's my opinion, okay? But with that being said, like I said in the last pros and cons about owning a house is a good investment in the long run for a primary house. Behavior-wise, if you say, yeah, I know my behavior and I want that automatic, like, yes, I'm going to build some equity and I'm just going to be disciplined to pay this off, then it's a good idea as well. So those are the things to think about. Like I said, we're going to be rolling out some more podcasts and videos, deep diving into different aspects of owning a house. I'll put those in the show notes and in the YouTube comments and whatnot. So if you guys have any questions, you know how to reach out to us. We'll see you on future episodes. Talk to you soon.